fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCOQ 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of a Mystery. I'm Al Warren, Mr. Michael Hawley.
Hi, Al. How you doing?
I'm doing good, I guess. Not really. I haven't slept in a week. But,
of course.
but you know how it is. Busy man. Lots of things going on. And middle of summer, it always flies by. I always got too much to do.
Right.
But
so we on the East Coast, we get hit with the Canadian fire, smoke, and all that stuff.
Well, you know that was a planned thing.
I'm thinking that. Yes.
Yeah. We're blowing smoke up here.
I like that one. That's a good one.
Yeah. Well, somebody's got to clear things up down there. It's what a mess. So we have these fires going and we blow smoke down there. We hire people, college students to blow the smoke all across the border. All a conspiracy here, right?
Gotcha. Conspiracy stuff, that works sometimes. Yeah. Part of the fake news world, but it's a thing now.
Yeah, it's part of the thing. Science fiction gone too far.
Right, especially like with this Oppenheimer stuff that I heard. Oh, yes.
Yeah, stranger than fiction. Well, we've got the author today, and he's Canadian, so look out, he's blowing smoke down there too. That's his next book. So, Mr. Robert J. Sawyer, thank you for being here.
Alan, it's delightful. Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure. So what's going on? You've been blowing smoke down to the States? Is this
I feel bad about it because, of course, absolutely, the States is taking a lot of the brunt of these wildfires in Canada. On the other hand, for quite some time in years gone by, we used to get all the smoke from the California wildfires coming up into Canada. So it really is, it just underscores the global nature of this problem. Eastern Canada on fire, Western Canada on fire, California on fire. It's just, we're living in a tinderbox, and it's very, very frightening, I have to say.
Yeah. There's been a lot of fires going on, and it's strange because I haven't seen so many fires. I think especially Alberta and Quebec now is got fires going on, not just BC. And
that's right. Absolutely. That's right. British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec, and some in Ontario here where I live as well. We had the hottest June on record. Last week, we had the 3 hottest consecutive record-setting global average temperature days since record keeping began. I think you got to admit that there's a tie-in here to just the world is getting warmer and fires are getting more severe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How does that go for a writer like you? Because you deal with a lot of alternative facts in a sense. Like you're creating a world, or you're taking something like in your book, the Oppenheimer alternative. So you've taken some event or some time in history, and you've kind of made a change, an alternative, let's say, to what we figure happened or we know happened. But how is it, I was going to say in this world today, because you hear so many of these conspiracies, like we make fun of it, like on the show and stuff, but there's people dead serious about a lot of these conspiracies.
It really is difficult, I have to say, to be a science fiction writer in, the year 2023, if you're writing anything in the reasonably near future, the rest of this decade, at the first half of the 21st century, maybe even the rest of the century, because it's all nuts. No matter how crazily we predicted things were going to go, they've gone even more insane. And B, it's all happening so rapidly that it really is hard to keep up. Now, one of my hallmarks as a science fiction writer actually has been mostly near future or present day science fiction, very often indeed set in Canada, where I live. And a number of my colleagues, Charlie Stross, a great British science fiction writer, for instance, is just, thrown in the towel and says you can't do near future anymore. By the time the book is out, reality will have changed and pivoted so many times that whatever you thought you were extrapolating forward to has been completely invalidated by, let's say, a COVID pandemic, let's say a war breaking out in Europe, like the invasion of Ukraine. Who knew that these things were going to come down the pike so quickly? And then right now, the incredible rise of artificial intelligence in this calendar year. I mean, incredible.
Yeah.
Well, and I see things. It floors me, because no matter what happens in the news, and it doesn't have to be just political, but, for instance, that little underground submarine that went down to see the Titanic wrecks that imploded and stuff. Now there's like a dozen conspiracy theories on that. Like, people are everything has to be a conspiracy now. There has to be a meaning.
Yeah, certainly we'd like human beings have always liked there to be an explanation, a meaning, somebody who caused things to happen. And, sometimes accidents just happen. On the other hand, there's a lot of the things that are going on right now that are our own fault too. I mean, climate change and so forth. We got to take a lot of blame for what's going on. But, the submarine, you just have to look at the Titan was the name of the submersible. It had not been certified. It had not passed safety checks. Its own pilot and CEO of the company that was running it said, safety is overrated. Well, he went down and died because of that arrogance.
Right.
What appeals to me, and appeals is, I use this very advisedly because it's a tragedy,
right,
but appeals to me as a writer is the irony of saying, we're going to pay no attention to warnings. We're going to name our submersible Titan. We're going to go down and look at the ruins of the Titanic. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, talk about tempting fate.
Yeah. It's just crazy. I would be scared to write in your case in that sense. I would be nervous, kind of like what, about how things change so quickly nowadays, and how things can be taken out of your hands and you've got a book completed and stuff. I'd be a little bit frightened. And also, do you have people, I would imagine this too, you have people that read your books and they find things in your book, or they find a meaning in something you've written that totally wasn't even on your mind, totally blows you away when they come up with it.
Well, that does happen. Obviously there's a gap between when I finish the book and when it's out. I'm a traditionally published author, so, and even if though I'm a priority for the publishing company, it's still a year from when I finish a book until it's on bookstore shelves. And for people who are a little farther down the food chain, it's often 2 years from when they finish their manuscript to when it's actually in bookstores. 2 years is, it's a geologic era now, the way things are moving. If you wrote a book 2 years ago and didn't have generative AI, chat GPT, or had not thought, that there was ever going to be war again in Europe or any of these things, it's very, very difficult. That said, I'm always delighted when people say, oh, how did you figure that one out? And, sometimes you get them right. And that astonishes them. I remember when Benedict XVI became Pope. I had predicted that the Pope at that time would be named Benedict XVI in a novel that was written in 1995.
Sweet.
And how did you do that? Well, I just looked at all the popes who hadn't disgraced themselves. Some names aren't coming back. And then looked for who was due to have a comeback as a name and whose numbers should go up one. And Benedict XVI was easy enough to come up with. So whereas John, who had been, of course, the apologist pope during World War II, and had been somewhat complicit in allowing Hitler to have his reign of terror, that name isn't coming back as a standalone name ever again.
Well, you should have, said you were psychic. You had this moment, and then you would be Sawyer the psychic.
Well, it's telepathy, right? A good standard science fiction theme. And, that dates back to the 30s and 40s and 50s when there was legitimate research going on to investigate mind reading, telekinesis, and remote viewing at places like Duke University, a legitimate university. What they found, of course, is that it's all bunk. But for the time in which it entered the parlance of science fiction, mind reading, the Vulcan mind meld on Star Trek and all this kind of stuff, it looked like legitimate science. And these things get kind of grandfathered into science fiction as they accrete over time. We pick up a lot of stuff that probably if we were starting from scratch today as a new genre, we probably wouldn't have as part of our wheelhouse.
So your book, the Oppenheimer alternative. Now, there's been a lot of press and a lot of talk about Oppenheimer, and then there's the Nolan movie. There's everything happening. How does that affect you? How is this going for you?
So the Oppenheimer alternative, although it's my most recent book, my next one comes out this fall. It actually is 3 years old now, and it kind of got clobbered by COVID. I insisted to the publisher that it be out for the 75th anniversary of the first atomic bomb test, which was July 16th. The 75th anniversary was July 16th, 2020. And then 3 weeks later, the bombing of Hiroshima. And 3 days later, the bombing of Nagasaki, for those 75th anniversary events. And we had a book tour planned. We had a book launch scheduled for Los Alamos, where, of course, the Trinity test had originally been done. And everything got shut down because of COVID. So I thought my little book, which I'm very proud of. I think it's the best book I've ever written, my 24th novel, The Oppenheimer Alternative, never got the kick at the can that it deserved. And then lo and behold, after I finished my book, Christopher Nolan announced that he was making this $100 million, he hopes, blockbuster film telling the story about J. Robert Oppenheimer, and it premieres on July 21st, 2023. So I've been doing what I can to, ride the coattails a little bit of that, since there's Oppie fever right now. But I got to tell you honestly, Michael and Alan, I'm not sure it's going to be the hit film that Christopher Nolan wants it to be. When he started making it, that was pre the invasion of Ukraine. That was pre us worrying again about nuclear war, right?
Right.
And the idea that a summer film to go see is 3 hours of watching in excruciating detail the Trinity test and the bombing and killing of civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'm stunned that he's done IMAX 70 millimeter, and most of the film is in black and white. They seem like completely opposite choices, a black and white film and IMAX 70 millimeter. I don't know how it's going to do in the box office, but I sure hope it gives my book, The Oppenheimer Alternative, a little bit of additional legs these next couple of weeks.
What does he base his story on? Like, what's different about him, or do you know what's different about him?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So his is, he doesn't like the term, Christopher Nolan, but it is what the industry calls a biopic, a biographical motion picture. There's nothing speculative or, if there's any fiction in it, it's because he stretched the truth, not because he's ignored the truth. And he did buy the rights to a very fine book as the basis for his film. He bought the rights to the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Oppenheimer called American Prometheus. And the subtitle is The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. American Prometheus by Martin J. Sherwin and Kai Bird. Kai, an unusual first name, K-A-I. Kai Bird and Marty Sherwin. And Marty, who sadly passed away recently, didn't get to see the film based on his book, did give me a lovely cover blurb for my novel when he read it back in, I guess, 2020. So the film Oppenheimer is based on the best biography of Oppenheimer that was ever written. Oppie himself never wrote an autobiography. Many of the famous Manhattan Project scientists did. He did not. So this is the best account we have of his life. My book is a novel that purports to tell the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer in reality up until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then following on from that, where he attempts to rehabilitate his public perception, which became very negative when he was branded a communist in kind of a McCarthy era, a witch hunt.
Yeah, actually, I've been doing a lot of reading and research in that era, and I'm blown away about how involved it really was. That was a very serious thing in that time period of being a communist.
Yeah, we look at it today as something that lots of people flirt with on university campuses: communism, socialism, all kinds of things, right? And of course, nobody is happy about really any of the actual extant communist governments. They don't function very well. But the Red Scare in the 1950s, McCarthy going after people who, in the 30s and 40s, it had been a fairly innocent thing to be a member of the American Communist Party. Oppie himself, and nobody has ever been able to prove the opposite, Oppie himself claims that he never was a member of the Communist Party. But that said, there was no doubt whatsoever that his wife Kitty was, that his brother Frank was, that his mistress Jean Tatlock, played by Florence Pugh in the upcoming movie, was, that he certainly was a fellow traveler, as the phrase went, very sympathetic to a lot of the ideals. But when they came after him hard for his communist associations. And for a guy who his whole life had been about, in terms of the Manhattan Project, being the insider. One of the other great biographies of Oppenheimer is called Oppenheimer Inside the Center, about his desire, his compulsion to be in the middle of things, to be having lunch with presidents and being on first name basis with generals. All of that was stripped from him very pettily by the United States government.
And they never did. Did he ever, win back any of his, was there any positive feedback about him eventually, or?
So what happened was this. He was stripped of his what's called a Q clearance, the letter Q, which meant access to nuclear secrets. He was stripped of that, never able to have any access to that information again until 1963. Now it's 1945 is when he had his great triumph, creating the atomic bomb. So 18 years later, he was stripped for 18 years of his, and never got his Q clearance back. But in 1963, just before he was assassinated, John F. Kennedy, the president of the United States, had decided to give the Enrico Fermi Medal to Oppenheimer, which is Fermi, of course, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, which was considered, next to the Nobel Prize, the biggest prize you could get in physics. And then, of course, Kennedy was assassinated, and Oppie thought he'd been announced that he was going to be the recipient. He'd been not publicly announced, but on the QT said, "Hey, come to Washington, you're going to get a medal." And then he thought it was all lost, and miracle of miracles, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, went ahead and gave him the medal. And as Oppie said, I suspect there was more than a little charity on your part, Mr. President, meaning Mr. Johnson, and more than a little bravery on your part to go ahead and give this to me. He meant given all the people who thought that he was a communist.
Right, because that was a big deal. I've been researching a case for the Goldmark family out of Seattle, the senator, and how,
yes,
they accused him. And then in the 80s, his son, a lawyer in Seattle, was killed along with his family by that guy who belonged to the group that thought he was a communist. He thought he was, the father, not the son, and he killed the whole family. And so it had a huge impact, much more than I think we realize.
It did. Aaron Sorkin did a very interesting made-for-TV movie or miniseries starring Nicole Kidman about Lucy and Desi. I think that was the title of it. And, of course, Lucille Ball was investigated for being a communist as well. And, of course, Desi from Cuba was also implicated. And so the United States at that time pretty famously would go after anybody, including nobody was more beloved than Lucille Ball. And nobody had done more to bring the war in the Pacific to an end than J. Robert Oppenheimer. Doesn't matter. They went after them. As Albert Einstein said of Oppie, Oppie's greatest flaw is that he's in love with a woman who doesn't love him back. And that woman is the United States government.
Well, wasn't it just last year that they nullified that decision?
Yes, finally. Of course, doesn't do him any good. He's dead. Didn't do his daughter any good. She committed suicide. She had wanted to be a United Nations translator. Like her father, she was a polyglot, spoke many languages. She couldn't get security clearance to work at the United Nations because her father had lost his security clearance and had been branded a communist. So Oppie died without being vindicated. His daughter committed suicide as part of the aftermath of this. She's a very disturbed woman in a lot of ways, but part of the aftermath of all it cost his daughter her life. But yes, they finally vacated. They called it vacated the conviction in his Security Review Board hearing that he was not, in fact, to be allowed nuclear secrets. So too little, too late. But yes, finally, as they always say, another famous saying about the Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else first.
Oh boy. Yeah, that
sounds like me too. I'm from Buffalo.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, absolutely. That's right. Where you could just be destroyed, and really destroyed because the guy who went after Oppie, Louis Strauss, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and a senator named Hickenlooper, and so forth. The people who went after him, they felt, just as a lot of the Me Too movement, that the movement was so important, it didn't matter if the targets deserved to be targeted or not. They were collateral damage. As long as the movement was advancing, the anti-communist movement or the movement to oust all of the sexism and sexual abuse and assault in the entertainment industry, in particular with the Me Too movement, that it didn't matter who was being run over as long as the cause was being advanced. And we saw careers ruined by communist witch hunt, and we saw some careers ruined too by the Me Too movement, very much so. And of course, some deserving people who were brought down. Roger Ailes, classic example of a guy who should have been brought down decades earlier, the former president of Fox News.
Right. Well, so when you go through this, like when you wrote this book and when you put it together and doing the research, how does something like that change you as a person and as a writer for the next book?
It really does change you because, everybody knows something, even before all the hype around Christopher Nolan's film that's about to debut. Everybody knew something about J. Robert Oppenheimer, father of the atomic bomb. Well, that phrase can't help but have an emotional weight for you, whether you thought it was right or wrong that the United States used it. Obviously, the Japanese were not big fans of it being used at all. But when you get into really researching the man, J. Robert Oppenheimer, such a complex individual, as I. Robbie, who was one of the few people who spoke in Oppenheimer's favor at his Security Review Board hearing, said of himself, Robbie, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, R-A-B-I is the spelling of that name, said, God knows, Lord knows, I'm a complicated person. But compared to Oppenheimer, I'm very, very simple. Oppenheimer was so bright, so much a genius, and so conflicted. Very mixed up person, mixed up about his sexuality. He was certainly bisexual, possibly even just out and out homosexual, but not able to deal with that as a person born in the first decade of the 20th century. He tried to kill his tutor at Cambridge University, the Cavendish Laboratory, Patrick Blackett. Oppie was in love with him, made a pass at him, was rejected, and Oppie actually covered an apple and left it as the traditional gift for the teacher with cyanide for Patrick Blackett. Yeah, and he only got away, somebody recognized that Oppie was unstable in this area. Oppie's father, who was a very astute collector of original artwork, showed up at Cambridge, bribed Cambridge with original paintings that were worth a fortune and said, if you don't press criminal charges, Oppenheimer, my son, Robert, will get psychiatric treatment and he will go away from England and not come back. And that's how he got away with it. But he was, in fact, immediately set off to be treated by a great disciple of Freud, psychoanalysis, to try and sort out why he tried to kill somebody.
Wow. How do you decide what you're going to include in a story or in a book when you're doing this research and you find out so many details?
And it's tricky because when you're writing about a man who was real and did have family members, at least one of which, his son, is still alive, and of course there are other people who are related to him and knew him, you have to be a bit of a, I gotta say, you gotta be a bit of a jerk if you're going to be an author. You gotta say, I'm not going to worry about what the people who knew him thought. It would have been very easy for me to go to Peter Oppenheimer, his son, who's a middle-aged man now, and say, hey, Peter, I'm writing a novel where your dad's the main character. What do you think about that? And Peter might very well have said, can you leave out, the fact that he cheated on my mother? His mother, Kitty, was, he was cheating on her with Jean Tatlock. Yeah, people have talked about that so much. Will you leave it out? Well, I didn't ask Peter, and I left it in. And apparently there are all kinds of nude scenes between Cillian Murphy and Florence Pugh, who is playing his Oppie's lover, Jean Tatlock, and Cillian Murphy's playing Oppenheimer. And in fact, there's a Twitter storm going on right now about it because Cillian Murphy is 20 years older than Florence Pugh, and yet he's playing her lover in a typical Hollywood fashion of there being a huge age gap between the man and the woman. In reality, there was a 10-year gap between Oppenheimer and Jean Tatlock. But yeah, you got to decide that your duty is to the audience, not to the people who knew the real person you're writing about.
Yeah.
To tell the truth. Or as, Yusef Kars, the great Canadian portrait photographer, when he did his great portrait of Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, Khrushchev said, capture me, warts and all. That's your job, warts and all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's still, I would still wonder what rabbit holes you would go down. How long did it take you to do the research on him?
Well over a year of full-time, I'm talking 40 hours a week research. My full-time job was just researching Oppenheimer, the other physicists involved with the Manhattan Project, and the circumstances of, the Los Alamos laboratory, the creation of Fat Man and Little Boy, although the characters involved with it. It was fascinating, and I could have spent more time researching. I write my novels to support my research habit. Nobody will pay me to do the research I want to do, but they'll pay me to write a novel.
Did you have the idea of what you were going to do before you researched?
No.
And then that supported it? Or you just decided, I want to do a fiction novel or a sci-fi novel on Oppenheimer?
Exactly. And that's an excellent question, Michael, because if you decide in advance what your angle is going to be, then you get into confirmation bias, which is why so many conspiracy theories flourish, right? You only look for the information that supports what you've already made up your mind about. This is why I could never watch the TV show The X-Files, because Fox Mulder had decided, I want to believe, he'd made his decision, I want to believe in the aliens, and so the evidence that supports the existence of them, I will keep seeking out, and the evidence that they don't exist, I will not even look for, I will ignore. And to me, science fiction means being legitimately scientifically oriented. You go in with no preconceptions. Now, I came out with a very, I'd like to think, sophisticated and nuanced understanding of Oppenheimer, not as, a monster and not as a saint. And it's going to be very interesting to see what Christopher Nolan does in his movie, because it's way too easy to ultimately decide that it's Saint Robert Oppenheimer, that he was crucified by the United States government and ultimately, was reborn thanks to the largesse of that I mentioned before of LBJ, of Lyndon Baines Johnson. It'll be very interesting to see whether Nolan and the actor Cillian Murphy paint Oppenheimer warts and all.
Yeah, that's got to be the hard thing, because you could purposely put in kind of the bad things and focus on all the negative toward what he had done in his life, and it would come out like he was an evil person. There would be nothing about. That's got to be, it's got to be tough not to get too far into one area without showing the other. That's got to be a real difficult process.
It really is. And when you're writing, a novel that you've made up out of whole cloth, people expect there to be a protagonist, that is a hero, and an antagonist, that is a villain. That's pretty standard in most genre fiction. In real life, of course, very few people think that they're the evil one, that think that they're the antagonist. And in the story of Oppenheimer, is Oppenheimer the hero or villain? Is Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, who very much opposed Oppenheimer and was largely responsible for his downfall, branding him, agreeing that he probably was a security risk. Is he a hero or a villain? Well, none of them would have said that they were the villains in the piece. And it's a really tough writing job to write a novel that doesn't have a clear-cut hero and doesn't have a clear-cut villain, but still has lots of drama and conflict and action, and hopefully some humor and some romance and some adventure and all the things that make for a rip-roaring read.
Right. You kind of got to show all aspects of humanity, because that's what we all are, really.
That's right. Absolutely. And, this is why, despite the fact that I'm a science fiction fan, as well as a writer and reader, I'm not a huge Star Wars fan. For me, the biggest non-starter in Star Wars is the characters themselves know if they're good or evil, right? They know if they're on the dark side or the light side of the Force. Darth Vader knows that he's evil. Luke Skywalker knows that he is good. And there's no debate amongst that, Whereas in Star Trek, which is more nuanced, the morally conflicted characters have to make morally complex decisions, which I find much more interesting in terms of my diet of entertainment.
Right. It's more realistic in a sense.
It's much more realistic. This is why the polarization in politics today, whether it's in Canada or the United States or anywhere, I find so frustrating. Nobody is pure villain. Nobody is pure hero. And yet, if you listen to people talk about Joe Biden or Donald Trump, or in Canada, Pierre Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre, who is the leader of the Conservative Party up here, they're painted, depending on who you ask, as pure villain or pure hero. And of course, they're neither of those things. Nobody is.
But it's a team sport. My Buffalo Bills always are the best.
Well, you have a good point. That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and so how do you develop the character, like the personality of these people in your book, considering that they're all past? And so you're kind of going by, I guess, actions and maybe biographies and things like that. So how do you decide how you make this person's dialogue?
Yes, it's very interesting. Now, in terms of Oppenheimer, the actual man, of course, an enormous amount was recorded. For instance, the multi-day security hearings were all, audio recorded as well as transcribed word for word. And he did an enormous number of interviews with, for instance, the great American journalist on CBS, Edward R. Murrow. So there are all kinds of tape recordings, some motion picture film as well of Oppie. The way he spoke, very soft-spoken, very erudite. And it's kind of interesting. I just read an interview yesterday with Cillian Murphy, who had to decide, of course, how much of an impersonation he was going to do of Oppenheimer for portraying him on film. Oppie, for instance, despite being an extraordinarily charismatic, good-looking man, was duck-footed. He had an odd gait. His feet were splayed at 90 degrees to each other. He also had a habit when he was thinking, how I might say or huh? He would go, nim, 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 N-I-M, nim, 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 all the time. Now, I put that in once or twice in the novel. That's all you need to show those savvy readers that you're aware of the habit. But can you do that in a 3 3-hour film, right? The tour that got the people lost on Gilligan's Island was as long as this Oppenheimer film. 3 hours. You can't have every few sentences the main character going nim 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 nim. Drives people nuts. So there's a triage you do, both as a novelist and Cillian Murphy, and of course the director Christopher Nolan had to do as actor and director. What do you leave in? What do you leave out? And in the end, I had more latitude because, you know, I don't know how long the cuts are going to be in the Oppenheimer movie, but the standard cut shot on screen length of an American motion picture for the last 50 years has been about 3 seconds before you change frame to something else. And that requires quite punchy dialogue. In a novel, you can allow people to go on a little longer, and you can have scenes that go on, you know, for what would be a 15-minute scene if it was actually filmed, whereas most scenes only last no more than 2 to 3 minutes. So the pacing that's forced upon people, again, it's real conundrum for this film Oppenheimer. We're all brought up now on the Marvel superhero films, and lightning fast pacing, lightning quick cuts, constantly busy, packed to the gills frame, every detail filled in. And Nolan wants us to sit still for 3 hours of a story that unfolds at quite a languorous pace over many years of J. Robert Oppenheimer's life. Again, I don't know how it's going to do in theaters, but I hope it does well. Obviously, anything that's good for people understanding Oppenheimer is good just generally for people's education, and also obviously for my book, The Oppenheimer Alternative.
Right, which is the key thing there, right? You know, that's...
Well, you know, my accountant thinks so. I'm just happy that, you know, I'm disappointed when I look at the cast list because there are major figures that should be major figures in Nolan's film. You can't really tell Oppenheimer's story without having his relationship with Edward Teller. But Teller's not a major figure in Oppenheimer's film. With Oppenheimer's best friend, Håkon Chevalier, who Oppenheimer ruined, and again, not a major character in the film. And so on and so forth. Leo Szilard, who was the guy who started the Manhattan Project, not a major character. So, you know, Nolan has had to pick and choose. I got to have a wider canvas, in a way, having a novel, even than he has in 70 millimeter IMAX.
Right. So the target audience for that film coming up probably is an older group.
But you can't have hemorrhoids because it's a 3-hour film. So it's that subset, Michael, of old people who don't have hemorrhoids who can sit still for 3 hours. And don't need to go to the washroom, right? 3 hours. Yeah. So it's really going to be fascinating to see how well it does. And you know, this is an incredible choice that the young audience will have to make on that fateful day, Friday, 21st of July, because that's the opening day for Oppenheimer and for Barbie, the film based on Mattel's Barbie doll franchise, starring Margot Robbie. These two, you cannot ask for two more different films competing for the title of the summer blockbuster. And I gotta say, you know, one of them, Barbie, sounds like it's going to be lots of fun and, you know, the kind of thing that, might be a fun way to spend an evening in the summer. And Oppie may, in fact, be an endurance test. Whereas, of course, you can read my book, or for that matter, the wonderful biography, American Prometheus, that I mentioned earlier, at your leisure over the course of several nice, pleasant summer nights on your back porch, you know, sipping a mint julep as Oppie himself might have, or actually a martini, his favorite drink. He was legendary as a maker of martinis, famously strong and famously good.
Well, you know, I think you might do better just renting Barbie and reading the book, because it'll be pretty vapid watching Barbie. There won't be a whole lot of substance there.
People have come out of advanced screenings of the Oppenheimer movie and said it's devastating. What Christopher Nolan decided to do, and I can understand as a filmmaker you want challenges, he decided to recreate the first ever atomic bomb explosion, the Trinity test, which happened near Los Alamos, New Mexico, in actually close to Alamogordo for the actual test. in July of 1945, the first ever atomic bomb explosion. And he decided to do it with conventional explosives and film it with IMAX. But it's very few people have witnessed an atomic bomb explosion with unshielded eyes and survived. It killed an enormous number of people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And at Alamogordo, the original test, of course, everybody was wearing welder's glasses, and so didn't really see it with the naked eye. But Nolan has decided to show us in 70 millimeter IMAX, 6-story high screens, what it was actually like. And people come out of that apparently really devastated. So it's, I can understand the technical challenge, and he didn't want to use CGI. He wanted to do an actual explosion. But I don't know how people are going to say, Barbie, light and frothy, or I can watch this and be scarred for life. It's going to be interesting to see what the box office figures are.
Well, it's certainly not going to be a feel-good movie. I mean,
no, and we have seen, and Michael, you mentioned very wisely that this probably appeals to an older crowd. Well, we just saw the latest Indiana Jones film, the fourth and final one, tank at the box office, because guess what? The older crowd isn't going to movies anymore. So
right.
It'll be very interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I don't. Ever since COVID, and now I have no desire to go back, actually.
It was a game changer, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I decided, after COVID, I bought a nice big, 75-inch 4K TV, quality sound bar and all of that. And I'm more than content with my home theater setup for almost every film that I want to see.
Right. Why go out and fight the screaming kids and sticky seats, and you can just stay home and do it yourself, and it's much better.
That's right.
That's right. But I am one of those that loves to do that. But my problem, though, is my hemorrhoids, and so I can only make a 2-hour movie. Sorry about that.
You're absolutely right. A 3-hour sitting thing is very difficult.
Yeah.
And there's no intermission, which is interesting. I remember.
Oh, really?
Way back in the day, I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey at its first run, 1968. I was 8 years old. And they had an intermission. That movie was only 2 hours and 40 minutes. But they realized even then, you got to have an intermission. 3 hours is an endurance feat. So it'll be interesting to see. Anyways, probably enough about Oppenheimer. I wanted to also mention, Alan, that I've been very lucky recently, even though it's 3 years since my last book, that I just got the L. Ron Hubbard Lifetime Achievement Award presented at the Writers of the Future banquet in Los Angeles. And of course, I just want to mention that because it meant a great deal to me as a Lifetime Achievement Award. I'm getting a couple of Lifetime Achievement honors this year, that award. And also I'm author guest of honor at the 81st World Science Fiction Convention, which is being held in Chengdu, China, for the first time ever in China. Its first one in 1939 was in New York City, in October of this year. But Hubbard endowed the Writers of the Future contest for up-and-coming science fiction writers. I've been a judge of that contest since 2005. Entered the contest before I was an established writer. No entry fees. Anybody can enter. The biggest and best names in science fiction, including my friend Nnedi Okorafor, who just announced today that she sold a novel for 7 figures to a major U.S. publisher. Wow. As one of our judges, along with me and Gregory Benford, Larry Niven, Nancy Kress, the biggest names in science fiction. Go to writersofthefuture.com for all the information. And our latest anthology winners, the 39th volume, L. Ron Hubbard Presents Writers of the Future, Volume 39, just came out in bookstores everywhere.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We have a couple of the new writers that made that edition coming up next week.
Oh, excellent, excellent. I am always delighted when some of the, I live in Toronto, when some of the winners turn out to be Canadian, which we had this past year, because as a judge, none of us judges see the names. So we don't know, the name, the ethnicity, the gender orientation, the geographic origin, nothing at all, just whether you've written good stories. So I'm always happily surprised in retrospect. when some of them turn out to be Canadians. But we're delighted. We have had winners from all over the world. And it is such a thrill to be involved with that contest.
How does, this is a hard question, but how does it feel to be winning lifetime achievements? Does that make you feel old?
Yes, it does. I am 63 years old, and I'm gratified that people are looking back on the career and saying, yeah, you made a difference as a writer. And I also realize that there are lots of, one of the reasons I'm a judge for Writers of the Future, lots of exciting new voices coming up. I'm quite content to be kind of the grand old man of Canadian science fiction these days. And although I'm still writing, as I say, I have a new book coming out this fall, but I am nonetheless pleased to see that, because there was nobody writing Canadian science fiction, by which I mean a Canadian writing science fiction set in Canada, until I came along. And I am delighted to see so many people following in my footsteps. So yeah, absolutely. A career retrospective is a bit of a sobering thing. You look back and say, yeah, way more years have passed than I've got left. But it also is really nice to be recognized.
Well, you broke the mold, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Everybody was telling me when I started off, don't set your stories in Canada. And I said, why not? Yeah. Said, nobody in the States will buy them. And I said, who has tested that proposition? Yeah. And now my first novel came out in 1990. So that's 33 years ago. And in all that time, no American editor, publisher, agent, bookseller, or reader or reviewer has ever said a negative word about the Canadian content in my books. But Canadians are constantly saying, oh, Americans won't get that. Americans won't understand that. Americans won't want to read about that. We underestimate our great neighbors to the south. They have, certainly in the reading department, absolutely no prejudice. They read Canadians, they read Australians. You just have to look at the gigantic success of Stieg Larsson and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which was, Swedish, right? Scandinavian. That took America by storm. Nobody cares where you're from as a writer, or where your story is set, as long as you set a good story.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just getting the attention and getting it out there, because once you do that, it doesn't matter,
Exactly. Exactly.
But you, great, wise, old writer, you set a, kind of a standard in a sense of what you want people to take away from a book when you put it out?
I want them to be thinking about the book a month after they finished reading it. A month. Not, just when they've closed the book and go, that was kind of entertaining. I want them to take away something that's changed their perspective on the world. I know this sounds grandiose and highfalutin, but I think science fiction is important. It shocks people out of their complacency, whether it's their complacency about what the future might look like in terms of technology, about sociology, about gender roles, about ethical issues. And I certainly use my science fiction to explore all those things. And I want people to say, Rob, that book stuck with me and it made me think. And yeah, it's, means that my fiction isn't for everybody. Some people want just escapism, just an easy beach read. I like to think my books are easy reading. My language was clean and accessible and so forth. Clean, there's some dirty words, but yeah. Clean is in a journalistic style of, being quite easy to read, but I want them to be books that stick with you and make you think.
Right. That's important. So listen, how do people find Robert J. Sawyer?
Well, one of the predictions I got right many years ago, way back in 1995, was that this World Wide Web thing was going to be a big deal. And so I managed to score a wonderful URL, that is a web address, for my website. It's writer.com. S as in science, F as in fiction, writer.com. You can find everything you need to know about me and my work there. And my books are available worldwide, in bookstores for sure, but also in ebook editions for all platforms, audiobooks for every one of my books, including the Oppenheimer Alternative, and ebooks, audiobooks, print editions. But a good starting point is sfwriter.com to learn all about the world of Robert J. Sawyer.
Fantastic. Are you doing social media? Are you dancing on TikTok?
Yeah, I have a TikTok channel where I talk mostly about the history of science fiction. I am on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Patreon for those who want to have, support my work a little bit, maybe financially, and get to read novels in advance and see works in progress and all that kind of stuff.
Well, fantastic. Now, of course, we're going to have that up on our website.
Lovely. Thank you.
People can find you easily that way. They don't need a teleporter.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. The world comes to us, right? We don't, Star Trek was all about their 5-year mission to go places. We don't go anywhere anymore. We're post-COVID. We stay at home and the universe comes to us.
Yeah. Just missing the transport.
That's right. Exactly.
So Robert, I'm supposed to ask questions, but I just loved listening.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate
that. Outstanding.
Well, we appreciate you being here. Your last book is called The Oppenheimer Alternative, and of course it's out in stores now. Don't miss it. And of course our guest, Robert J. Sawyer. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure, my friends. Always good to chat with you.
Great speaking with you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me? Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.